Good morning, everybody. Welcome, and in many cases, welcome back to Peterhouse. For those of you who don't yet know me, I'm Brendan Sims. I'm actually welcoming you under two headings. I'm a fellow of this college of Peterhouse, but I'm also the director of the Centre for Geopolitics. The Centre is focused on promoting understanding of the geopolitical, past and present. We also try to make a connection between history and policy. We pay particular attention to Britain's relationship with certain areas of Europe over time, our British Spaces concept. And I think that the topic of today's colloquium from Brest-Litovsk, the Baltic in the aftermath of the First World War, 1918 to 1922, combines a lot of really important themes. I don't need to tell you, this is the period more generally in which is decided how to deal with the Russian Revolution, how to deal with the German question, defeated Germany, and of course it's a period of huge territorial transformations across the continent, but particularly also in the space we will be talking about. And then right at the end of the sort of more formal part of the proceedings, we'll have a roundtable which will look at the contemporary challenges to the Baltic Sea region. But that's enough from me for the moment. I'm now going to hand over to Charles Clarke, who indeed actually does need no introduction. You all know him either as the former Home Secretary and Education Secretary, but of course primarily as the co-director of the Baltic Geopolitics Programme. Charles.
Thank you very much indeed, Brendan. And can I just firstly echo Brendan's welcome. It's his home territory, Peterhouse, but if it wasn't for Brendan's leadership of the Centre for Geopolitics, we never would have been able to develop this Baltic Geopolitics Programme, and Brendan, I'm exceptionally grateful to you for that. As Brendan said, I'm joint leader of the programme with Brendan. We're very young. We were launched in January 2021, so just over 2 years ago. And what we are seeking to do is to firstly focus on the Baltic Sea region as a whole, secondly on the British relationship with that region, thirdly on geopolitical questions. We're ready to look at any questions, but always looking at their geopolitical consequences. So, for example, we had a very successful event in the House of Lords a few weeks ago on energy security in the Baltic region, which obviously has massive geopolitical implications. Fourthly, inspired by Brendan, we're driven to look at this from a historical point of view, and that has been the thing which has driven us in a wide variety of different ways, since we think talking about current geopolitical questions without locating them in the historical past is not a very good way to do it. And finally, we try and involve not only academics and their tremendous contributions, but also practitioners in a wide variety of different forms. So they could be diplomats, business people, government people, military people, or whatever. So that's what we've done. We've had a whole set of events. There's a leaflet that you can find which sums up what it's about. Our first big symposium took place last year here on the historical theme of understanding the Baltic states and their emergence, again, after 1991. And from that, this book has just been published in the last couple of weeks, which I'm very pleased with. And it's really been very positive. And Michael Dwyer, the managing director of Hearst Publishers, is somewhere in, I'm not sure he's actually in the hall at the moment, but he's certainly here at the event.
There he is.
There he is. Yeah. Right at the back, hiding, spying on all. If any of you have got books you want Michael to think about publishing, I can recommend her as an outstanding publisher of things in the Baltic region. But we owe a debt of gratitude to Michael for being ready to publish this as well. No doubt we'll come and make suggestions to him for other publications that we could do. So that's where we are. As far as the event today is concerned, I want to pay particular thanks to two people. Most important of all to Donatas Kupciunas, who's our research associate who is there, who many of you will have been in contact with in any case. But he's conceived and put together the programme and agenda for this particular day. And he's put a great deal of energy into it. We're delighted with the range of panelists and speakers who've agreed to participate today, starting with Holger in just a moment. And so I want to thank Donatus for the work that he's done on this, which has made it possible. But secondly, to our colleague John Freeman, who's just about to go and been pinched by the University of Greifswald. He's about to go and work there. But he's made the organisational aspect of all this work extremely well, so thank you very much indeed. So you're all very, very welcome. And I'm now going to hand over to Brendan to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you very much, Charles. It's a great honour and a pleasure to welcome to Peterhouse my old friend Holger Afflerbach, Professor of Modern History at the University of Leeds. We've actually known each other for over 30 years. I met him in the German State Archive, Prussian State Archive in Merseburg about 30 years ago when he was researching his landmark biography of Erich von Falkenhayn. That was a very interesting experience talking to him and then over time about those issues. He is a titan of the study of military history and the international history of early 20th century Europe. His book on Falkenhayn was followed by many other important books and articles, but in particular I'd like to single out the book on the Triple Alliance, really fundamental for understanding the origins of the First World War, and most recently a book that actually gained a huge amount of traction across Europe and the world, called On a Nice Edge, How Germany Lost the First World War. I thought I knew a lot about the First World War. There are very many things I realized that I didn't know when I read this book, and I'm very confident that we will look with fresh eyes at the history of the immediate post-war period when Holger steps up now, and he will deliver remarks lasting about 30 minutes, and then we will have some time for discussion. Holger, please.
Thank you very much, Brendan, for inviting me, and I'm very impressed by Peterhouse. It's the first time that I'm here, and it is really a great college. And I start with a comment on historians and memory, because I would have...
It was Italy, wasn't it?
Exactly. I would have betted my head that I met Brendan not in Merseburg, I met him in Rio Negro in Italy.
Yes.
And that is true.
Yes. Yes.
So
I'm a bad witness.
But the rest is true. And then we met in Mainz in the Institute for Europäische Geschichte.
Yeah.
So, and what is also true, it is now so many decades ago, I don't dare to count.
Yeah.
Well, today I want to speak about Brest-Litovsk and the consequences. And Brest-Litovsk was called by Wheeler Bennett, who has written probably the best book on the peace of Brest-Litovsk in the 1930s, was called by him the forgotten peace. Now you can ask, how is it possible that this peace was forgotten? For example, it was forgotten because it was only 9 months in power, because it was concluded in March 1918, and then the armistice in 1918 already made it void and nil. So it was overthrown 9 months after its conclusion. Then the Russian Civil War did most of its result, and the Soviet Union was later able to restore nearly completely its pre-1914 Russian borders. So it looked as if the Peace of Brest-Litovsk was a short-lived symbol of German imperialism. But after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, suddenly the borders of Brest-Litovsk reappeared. If you look on a map, there are striking similarities. And this is now what I want to examine in my paper, where the links are between what we see today and the short-lived peace of Brest-Litovsk. And I have to warn you, I have to use a very wide brush, because it is desperately complicated, the topic. And I hope I don't get lost. So, I want to start with one question. Was the Russian defeat in the First World War inevitable once the war started? The answer is no, despite the fact that the Russian military performance was poor. You are aware of the Battle of Tannenberg in August 1914. The Russians lost it. Or the Battle of Gorlice Tarnów in 1915. They had to evacuate Russian Poland afterwards. So militarily, it did not work well. Then the Central Powers, especially the Germans, were reflecting early on a kind of buffer state solution for Eastern Europe, conquering big parts of Eastern Europe on the expense of Russia, create buffer states. But that was not the key argument for the Central Powers, because they had to wage a Europe-wide war. They were very interested on getting the Russians out. And for that reason, between late 1914 and 1917, the Central Powers made several serious attempts to broker with the Russians a separate peace. I don't go through all these attempts now, because otherwise I would speak about separate peace feelers in the First World War, but I give you only one of the answers. In April 1915, Tsar Nicholas II said, on a peace feeler, my reply can only be a negative one. Well, he did not use the opportunity to save his country, his family, and Russia from the experiments which Russia had to experience afterwards. You know that in the First Russian Revolution in March 1917, the war forced Nicholas II to abdicate, and for a few months Russia was a liberal state. But also they did not conclude peace. They could, but they didn't. They wanted to hang on, Kerensky and his government, and that basically break Russia's neck. To say no to the options to leave the war with a political compromise. Well, instead of that, the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, who were unable to broker any political solution with Russia, tried Russia and also other states, but in Russia they were quite successful, to revolutionize the country, to topple the regime. And all of you are aware of, I have to continue with my slides. So, all of you are aware, it's not good, but all of you are aware of Lenin coming with German permission from Switzerland to the Baltic, and from the Baltic he went all the way to Russia. By allowing Lenin to cross German territory in the famous sealed wagon and so on, railway carriage, did the Germans know what they were doing? So the permission was given by Chancellor Bolshevik, but we have also a comment from the head of the military intelligence, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Nicolai. And he said later, I quote, "As everybody else, I did not know anything about Bolshevism." End of quote. We'll say they brought Lenin, they allowed Lenin to cross German territory in the hope to revolutionize Russia without knowing exactly what they were dealing with. The result is known to all of you. The October Revolution in Russia, Lenin and the Bolsheviks came to power. Well, it paid off for the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians because Lenin immediately asked for an armistice, and the armistice was granted in December 1917, and this is pretty much where my paper now starts in earnest. Because Lenin and the October Revolution in Russia was for Imperial Germany, on the one hand, a great blessing, and on the other hand, an enormous curse. The blessing was that Russia, the biggest of Germany's enemies, was defeated and had left the war. Germany had won the First World War on the Eastern Front. This was, of course, an enormous success. You cannot deny that. But there was a curse, and the curse was that Russia had now a communist government, and the communist government's program was social revolution, and social revolution was anathema for the Central Powers. So basically, there were the extreme opposites on everything what the Central Powers thought is right and legitimate. And the question how to deal with communist Russia became already during the peace negotiation a key question for German politics, and ever since. Well, now the peace negotiations. The peace negotiations took place in Brest-Litovsk. The Russian part, the Soviets, had suggested to make it in Stockholm, in a neutral place. But instead of that, the Germans insisted to make it in Brest-Litovsk, which was the headquarters of the German High Command in the east, Ober-Ost. And the place and the atmosphere set, of course, the scene. The negotiations took place from December 1917 to March 1918, and the resulting peace treaty was seen ever since as a product of a rapacious German imperialism. I'll throw now some numbers at you. The country lost, Russia lost 2.5 million square kilometers of territory. This was home to 50 million people. This was a third of the Russian pre-war population. They lost also 90% of all coal mines, 54% of its industry, and a third of its agricultural land and its transport network. So the idea that Brest-Litovsk was a German imperialist peace is an easy conclusion, and it would be absolutely idiotic to argue against. But it is incomplete. It is incomplete, and the incompleteness hinders the understanding. Because from the moment the armistice was concluded, three developments came together, and German imperialism was only one of them. The two others were the national principle, and the third one was anti-communism and anti-communism. And these factors were interplaying with each other, and created the long-term effects of the Peace of Brest-Litovsk, which can be seen still today. So the first argument, which I want to cover, is the easy one, the German imperialism. Of course, we have to speak about the imperialism of the Central Powers, because Germany, the Austro-Hungarians, and also the Ottomans tried to use the historical opportunity of Russian weakness to conquer big parts of Eastern Europe and to control big parts of Eastern Europe. On the other hand, the Central Powers were already struggling. Especially the Austro-Hungarians were so weak by then that the main interest they had was to get somewhere foodstuff for the starving population. Therefore, also the separate peace with Ukraine, also concluded in Brest-Litovsk. I will not cover that in detail because I will focus here more on the Baltic, and that would be an entire new can of worms. But they concluded the so-called Brotfriede, bread peace. This is a word coined by the Lord Mayor of Vienna, because Vienna was very close to a famine of medieval proportions. So they wanted grain. And Lenin even understood that, and he said, well, the Germans are only after the grain, and when they have it, they will leave. I think this is very optimistic. It is true for the Austrians, but it was not true for the Germans, because they wanted to remap on this occasion Eastern Europe. But they had a big problem doing so, because Germany had promised several times, the Kaiser in August 1914, and then the peace resolution of the German parliament in 1917, the 19th of July 1917, the peace resolution of the German Reichstag. They had promised not to make annexation, they were not making a war of conquest. So basically they had tied their hands. And now they try to maneuver around, making gains without making annexations. And that was a German problem in Brest-Litovsk. And they did that by using what the German Foreign Minister Richard von Kühlmann called, by using the fiction of self-determination. So basically using the fiction of self-determination to create a smokescreen over German conquests. All that was pretty clear, you could not hide that, even when Germany tried very hard. And Brest was a constant fighting match between Richard von Kühlmann on the one hand, and the leader of the Soviet delegation, Leon Trotsky, on the other hand. And it was a kind of, Trotsky used it as a public platform to create revolutionary uprisings in Germany and Austria-Hungary. There were big strikes, and the Soviets were hoping that the revolution will make all these peace talks anyway redundant. Well, the German delegation at Brest had also another problem, not only Trotsky and all these problems with trying to use self-determination to cover German attempts to control Eastern Europe, but they had also to fight against the own German. Here is, by the way, the delegation. Here you see Max Hoffmann, Czernin, Talat Pascha und Richard von Kühlmann in Brest. This is a treaty with Ukraine, Trotsky. And this is now where we are. The big problem of the German negotiators in Brest-Litovsk was that the own army command was permanently interfering. Especially Ludendorff was permanently coming with new ideas of how to control Eastern Europe, and they were also not shy not to care about annexations. They wanted to go straight forward and to annex big parts of Eastern Europe. They had to be put in check, and somehow the diplomats and the German government were able to control them, but it was cumbersome. It was also cumbersome that in Brest there was a representative of the Supreme High Command, General Hoffmann. What the hell had this man to do in the peace negotiations? Already contemporaries asked, what is the purpose of this man being at the peace table? Well, all that was made very difficult, and it was even made more difficult that big parts of German-occupied former Russian territories were under military administration, German military administration, and the Russians, of course, the Soviets said, if you want to have self-determination, pull away your troops so that the Baltic people can decide by themselves and independently and free what they want. As long as a German military government is there, this is not believable. But the German High Command said, we are not leaving before the war's over. Well, all that was difficult, And this is also the obvious part of the peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk, German imperialism. But what is now with the link between nationalism and anti-communism? In all Eastern European countries, the non-Russian populations of the Russian Empire were moving towards independence. Here we have now to make a short list. The first one is Russian Poland. Russian Poland had become a kingdom in November 1916, and this was recognized by the Russian liberal government already in March 1917. A similar process was going on now in 1917 in the Baltic, in Finland, and in Ukraine. And it started, but you know that much better than I do, and I'm looking forward to learn it from you, learn more about it. It started normally with relatively small groups and quests of autonomy, which then widened and became a full-fledged demand for full national independence. And all that was linked with anti-communism. Anti-communism and national self-determination went hand in hand because both was directed against the Russian communist government in St. Petersburg. So this basically brought all that together. At least, if we make a broad sweep, because if we look towards the details, we see that, for example, the Bolsheviks were able to mobilize parts of the non-Russian ethnicities in the former parts of the Russian Empire. For example, in Latvia, around 30% of the population obviously was favoring the Bolsheviks. So basically, the picture is a little bit blurred. I skip now Trotsky's famous idea on the 10th of February 1917 to break off negotiations, to declare now a no war, neither peace, and to go home. This completely backfired and led to the so-called German railway advance. So basically, Russia had demobilized and the Germans could follow without fighting. And this move made the German and Austro-Hungarian occupied zone of former Russian territory much bigger than it was before. So that move had long-lasting consequences also for the map of Eastern Europe. And here on this map you see the difference between the original line from Brest-Litovsk and the standard line after the Russians coming back and have to sign the treaty. The treaty was signed not by Trotsky, who did not return. It was signed by Sokolnikov with clenched teeth. So they put that in writing with clenched teeth. They signed the treaty. Okay. I come to the second point. So this was now the Peace of Brest-Litovsk. The second point is from Brest-Litovsk to the armistice in 1918. So, what is it about? It is basically about 9 months in which Germany desperately tried to organize Eastern Europe. And the result was absolutely chaotic. Well, we are speaking now about an absolutely shambolic 9 months, an orgy of disorganization and stupidity. I use hard words, but the hard words are a quote by Kurt Rietzler, former secretary of Weimar Germany, who called it an incoherent, with no concept whatsoever, a field of rubbles about the German plans for Eastern Europe. And maybe after 4 years of World War, Germany and Austria-Hungary were too exhausted to be able, also economically too exhausted, to develop any kind of coherent plan for these territories. So where are the problems in this 9 months? First one is how to deal with the communist government in St. Petersburg. And there were two big questions. The first one, cooperate with them, because the World War was ongoing in the West, so basically using the helps of the communists to win in the West, or try to topple the regime in St. Petersburg, which seemed militarily possible. So to go there to get rid of the communists, first question. And then, second question, what to do with the non-communist parts in Russia, we'll say the Whites. Unfortunately for Germany, the Whites were pro-Entente. We'll say this was not a real option to embark on the Whites. And the third one were problems with different nationalities, social classes, and pro-German and pro-Allied forces. Side story was the German minority in the Russian Ostseeskaya gubernia, would say the Baltic republics, and they had a German Baltic minority of around 7% of the population, and the 7% of the population owned more than 60% of the land. So there was a minority question linked with the social question, and all that made things even more difficult. I mentioned also very briefly the German intervention in the ongoing civil war in Finland. Because a German division under the leadership of General Rüdiger von der Goltz decided, helped Mannerheim to decide the Finnish civil war. Well, now I'm too. In these 9 months, all the German actions were not divided between politicians, so basically the plans go with the communists, go against the communists, were not divided that way. The military was for intervention against the communists and the civilians were for cooperating with them. No, it was absolutely across everything. Ludendorff was mostly for intervention against the communists, but Karl Helfferich, the second gentleman, was also for intervention against the communists, while Richard von Kühlmann, the German foreign minister, the third person on this list, and Paul von Hinze, his successor as for a German foreign minister, were absolutely against intervening because they said a weak Bolshevik government in St. Petersburg is for Germany the best solution possible. Well, I rounded up now the second part with German attempts to top the chaos which I was describing so far, with a ridiculous attempt to install on all these puppet states all over Eastern Europe German princes as kings and dukes. Now, where is it? Ah, other direction. Sorry. So, first slide. Friedrich Karl Prinz und Landgraf von Hessen-Kassel was supposed to become Frederick Karl, King of Finland. And Wilhelm Herzog von Urach was to become Mindaugas II of Lithuania. And Adolf Friedrich zu Mecklenburg was candidate as Herzog des Vereinigten Baltischen Herzogtums after Wilhelm II, who was also for a certain period of time in the race to become Duke or whatever of the Baltic states. And all that took place while there was a World War and a revolution and chaos, and they came really with this kind of ideas which shows you that this was pretty hopeless and shambolic. All that came to nothing. And in November 1918, the armistice declared peace of Brest-Litovsk to be void. And that is now a moment where the entire German attention was dealing with defeat in the West. And everything happening in the East, independently of how dramatic it was, took the back seat. They were interested in how to get along with the British, the French, the Italians, and the United States of America. And they were ready to give up everything in Eastern Europe if necessary. But the Allied in the armistice asked Germany even to stay there militarily and to control, for example, the Baltic territories from the Bolsheviks. So they asked Germany to stay, and the Germans did not know how, because the German Eighth Army, which had occupied the territories, was completely disintegrating. The soldiers went home. They were not under control, and for that reason they had to create the famous Free Corps. Say volunteers. They built a volunteer division, as the Garde Reserve Division, and they created the Free Corps. Oh yeah. So here we are. And here, one of the flags of the Free Corps. This is now something which you are probably much more acquainted with than I am, and I'm looking forward to hear your perspective later. But in 1919, there were fightings in the Baltic, and there were significant German volunteer units, the Free Corps, and the fightings were notorious. Notorious because the German Free Corps were kind of diehards. And they were behaving like early modern mercenaries and were even proud of doing so. And they came because there was a promise for land for settlement. A promise which was never made. It was a kind of fake, but they came regardless. There is also a brutalization theory in historiography, and this says that all the Baltic fighters, a lot of them, a surprising big number of them, ended up as stormtroopers in the Nazi Party, so that the Baltic experience was a stepping stone in the radicalization of the right wing in Germany. And I'm ready to discuss that later if wanted. But if we switch now to big politics, I want to make the following points. First, the German government helped and supported the Free Corps. And the second thing, there was a potential new alliance formed, the Western powers of Germany together against the Bolsheviks. But it was frail because they did not trust each other. And the third one was there was kind of civil war in the Baltic, not only between the Bolsheviks and the Whites, but also between the Germans and the Baltic people, and between social classes. So it is an extremely complicated and blurred situation, and the Free Corps made themselves redundant in having to kick out the Bolsheviks from Latvia after conquering Riga in May 1919. They basically had made themselves redundant. They were not anymore needed against the Bolsheviks. And then they, at some point, they were called home. Instead of doing so, they tried to join the Russian Whites, Beermont and his Western Russian army, which was also a dead-born, stillborn child. Okay. To round up, in reality, the story continues. Because I'm talking about something which is of relevance for the entire 20th century. And the story does not end at some point. It does not end with the Free Corps. It does not end with the Treaty of Rapallo. But given the fact that at some point I have to end for today, I decided that Rapallo is maybe as good as any other point. And Rapallo is maybe a turning point insofar as this question, do we cooperate with Soviet Russia or do we fight against Soviet Russia? It came to a first turning point, and they said, let's cooperate. And cooperate why? And here I quote Hans von Seeckt, commander of the Reichswehr, who said, breaking the Versailles dictate can only be achieved by close contact with a strong Russia. Whether we like communist Russia or not is irrelevant. So basically, Russia was needed against the West, and for that reason, Seeckt favored cooperations with them, and there were, over the entire 1920s, close German-Soviet cooperations. And all that started in Rapallo, where German Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau and Grigori Tchetchery, the Soviet Foreign Minister, concluded the German-Soviet agreement, basically declaring a number of economic questions and waiving a number of claims, mutual claims. Still, the central problem, the question between cooperation, confrontation with Soviet Russia, and the role of the states in Eastern Europe between the two powers was not finally answered. And from a German point of view, and this paper was from a German point of view, on all that, it was not from chaos to a new order, like the title of this conference. It was, I'm afraid, a stop on the road to a disaster of epic proportions. Thank you very much. It's our time there.
Well, thank you very much, Holger. I think that's really set us up brilliantly for the rest of the day, sort of a bird's eye view of this story, and we'll be focusing in greater detail, obviously, on the Baltic Sea region later on. Huge amount in what you've said. Obviously, the history which stands in its own right, but also the resonances with the present day, which you alluded to. We might fish out some of them in due course. But for now, there's an opportunity for questions. I've got 10 to 15 minutes. Who would like to begin? Yes, and if you could, I know most of you, but if you could give your name and your affiliation, if you have one, please.
William Wells from Rothschild. I'm curious, this is going slightly beyond the formation of the Freikorps. How come they ended up being internationally officered? In particular, British military officer detachments, when they were such a German organization?
What? It was the Freikorps, at least the Freikorps I was talking about was a purely German thing. And not only that, it was a purely German thing, they hated the English. Unfortunately, sorry for saying that bluntly, but if you don't believe me, you can read the autobiography of General Rüdiger von der Goltz. It's available, it's also online, it's very easy to find. And if you read that, you see absolute obstinacy against Britain, and this is this typical Wilhelmine Germany anti-British attitude. And they basically, he was so obstinate that probably his British counterparts were saying, well, are you aware that you lost the World War? So he behaved as if that had not happened. And they had no British officers.
Maybe we can come back to that.
Maybe you know more than me. This is also possible. So I will not say you're wrong. I'm not aware of it.
Janis Peschitz, I'm advisor to the Latvian president. Later, Field Marshal Lord Alexander of Tunis as a brevet lieutenant colonel in the Irish Guards, for a while commanded the Landeswehr, which was made up of local Germans, not the Imperial Germans, but local Germans, not necessarily from the landed classes either. They also had Latvians there, and they were used primarily against the Bolsheviks, in which they played an important part.
Okay, and if I may add up to that, because I told you I use the broad brush, because if you go into the details, the more you go into the details, the more complicated the picture becomes. Because I was speaking about Freikorps. Then first we had this volunteer division, which I mentioned. Erste Garde Reserve Division. Then we had the Freikorps, which were paid by Germany. So Germany paid the wages. And then we had Freikorps, which were hired by the so-called Baltic barons. So this German minority, this land-owning minority, they were paying people to fight for them. And if I got you right, Alexander was fighting for one of these organizations, which is true, but I would say also there, he was probably an exception, but you may prove me wrong.
There were a lot of advisors at that time. The first Latvian government, which was formed in late 1918, only survived because they took shelter on a British warship in Liepāja harbour, and therefore they were protected by the Royal Navy. That is a typical example of the way things were very difficult to understand, and yet later on Latvians were fighting alongside the von der Goltz against the Bolsheviks.
Any other questions?
Yes. Yeah, Carsten Bruggemann, Tallinn University. So this Alexander was being in charge of the Landeswehr only from late 1919 onwards, right? When all the major fighting by the German fighters was already over. So that was a moment when it was not simply impossible to think about a German unit being still led by a German. Because after Versailles, the Brits took over this one. My question is about Brest-Litovsk, actually the German position. And you have spoken about these ideas of self-determination, and in a way, these were semantic games, right? And I would like to ask you, what is your assessment of the German assessment of the real situation in Estonia and Latvia at the time? To what extent were they aware that they were dealing with a very tiny minority that did not really have the power to speak for everyone? They included some Estonians into this group of people they negotiated with. Marta has written about it. But to what extent were the Germans aware that this was just a game?
You mean the German Baltic minority?
No, the Germans in Brest-Litovsk. The Germans in Brest-Litovsk, to what extent did they realize that this was just a kind of political chantage?
How to answer that without needing 1 hour? Because Imperial Germany had 65 million inhabitants. And of course, then you could say that there in this big group of people there were different opinions. And there was, on the one hand, German diplomats like Richard von Kühlmann, the German military high command. Then there was a government in Berlin, Graf Hertling. Then there was Kaiser and his environment. Then there were of course, the parties in the Reichstag, the politicians. And if I start now with the last one, which is, I think, a very interesting one, because that shows also if Imperial Germany was an imperialistic machine or not. what were they saying? Well, say the parties in the Reichstag about the Peace of Brest-Litovsk. Because the majority of the Reichstag had, in July 1917, they said, we want peace, we don't want annexations, we don't want to enforce annexations, and all that. They had made a lot of goodwill actions, and they asked for peace. And now they basically had to approve in the Reichstag a peace which obviously was the exact opposite. The entire world said that basically Germany unmasked itself. It shows its rapacious nature. And, for example, the Social Democratic Party abstained in the final vote on Brest-Litovsk. So basically they did not vote for or against. And the reason was that they hated the conditions of the peace. They hated it, but they said it is a peace. And they were fighting a war point. They needed peace. And so they, as we say in German, they swallowed the trout. You know, you do something which you really hate for a greater good. That was the situation in the moment. And they said also it's kind of, you know, where the peace is completely unfair, and so we know it, there's time for revision. This is exactly the attitude reasonable people had in Britain, and especially in Britain after the conclusion of the Versailles Treaty. They said, well, now we have that and we can revise it in due course. So this is basically one answer. So political Germany was divided. And only, to mention that, only the Conservative Party, which was small, under the leader Graf Westrap, was for full-fledged annexations. All others were happy that this was not happening. And if we go now through the entire list of representatives and political responsible individuals in Germany in the Peace of Brest-Litovsk, we can, I stop talking, and you may ask more specific, with Wilhelm II. Wilhelm II in these months was completely out of control because he was fully under the influence of the military in this particular moment, and he had great dreams for Eastern Europe. So the Kaiser in this moment was not particularly helpful, to say it that way, and he was, like the military, a big fan of taking over big parts of Eastern Europe. Does that answer at least a part of your question? Thank you.
Thank you. So I have a final question, but I don't know if anybody else has something they particularly would like to ask, because I don't want to deprive. Yes, Charles.
It's a fascinating talk, thank you very much. And the picture that you give is essentially of anarchy in that part of the world from Brest-Litovsk onwards. I'm not quite clear how the Finland and the three Baltic states then got to a position of being able to be independent countries rather than part of either some Russian or German situation. It's an anarchic description that you've given, but how did that anarchy lead to the particular resolution which did take place in 1918, 1919?
So I would say this question probably will many people in this audience be able to answer in due course, but I would say it has a lot to do also with the circumstances of the moment. And I mentioned two things. I mentioned that Trotsky had this idea not to sign the treaty and to leave Brest. Neither war nor peace. Basically, Russia demobilizes, we stop fighting, but we don't sign this peace treaty because it is an outrageously imperialist peace. So we go home without signing it. This led to the Germans making this kind of railway advance and bringing a part of these territories, for example in Latvia, under the control of the Central Powers, which they were not before. So this was, for example, one precondition so that something could be settled there, because if it had been still under Russian, Soviet control, things may have come out differently. May, you know, this is now speculation. And the way it went so that they became independent was, for example, that after the German breakdown, the representative of Germany towards the Baltic, Winnig, made this Winnig note, basically giving independence, declaring, we declare independence. And the Germans had also created kind of puppet governments, Taryba in Lithuania and so on. And all that took a life of its own. The same was true in Poland. In Poland, there was a German and Austro-Hungarian puppet government, the Kingdom of Poland. A ridiculous construction, because the Kingdom of Poland had not a king, so there was no king, and it had no borders. It is an absurd creation, and they did that because they wanted to recruit a Polish army, which did not take off either, of course. So, but this was at least a core, and I think that is very important, that there was a core, that this core could then develop under different circumstances. And in the case of Poland, it went also very quickly and becoming fully fledged. And probably something like that can be compared with what happened with the Habsburg monarchy in the moment of its dissolution, because also, pang, from one second to the next, everywhere were new governments coming out of the blue, practically.
Thank you very much. Well, Holger, I think you've given us really the right framing that we need in terms of the broader picture of what was going on in Europe as a whole, and particularly Eastern Europe and Northern Europe. So I think we're going to come back again and again to the issues you've raised. Unfortunately, we have to conclude your keynote at this point, but not before thanking you very much indeed for getting us started in this way.
Thank you for your attention.